This week, I want to talk about something completely different. One species of fish that I've caught in England that very few people ever have is the American fish, largemouth black bass. People have tried to bring these black bass into England for many years. I think the first attempts go back to the late 1800s, and they were also brought across from America by ship to mainland Europe. One of the ponds that you see me fishing on some of my videos is Breach Pond near Wareham, and that was originally owned by a clay company called Pike, Fale and Co. And the Mr. Pike who owned that pit was a man called Leonard Pike. The working stopped probably about 1910. It was dug out by hand, around about 4 acres, quite deep, up to 25 foot of water. And by the 1930s, it had held water for at least 20 years. It filled up, took a few years, no doubt. And the workings around it had started to become more natural, sort of spoil heaps and so on. The original oak trees that had been planted in about 1850 were starting to mature, but like I say, there were spoil heaps and sort of things like scrub birch and rhododendron bushes sort of spread around it. And Leonard Pike was quite a wealthy man owning a clay company, or a share in it. Leonard Pike went to Donald Leney, who was a fish farmer from Surrey. He owned the Surrey trout farm. And Leney was dealing in just about every species that he could get hold of. And one of the species was the American largemouth bass, which he was importing from France. When they went to France, I don't know, possibly 1890, 1900, there had already been attempts to bring largemouth bass to England, as well as smallmouth bass. And where they went and what happened to them, no one really seems to know. But we do have a record of Leney supplying bass to Leonard Pike in 1935. He supplied 100 at about 25 pence each, or 5 shillings, which is quite expensive, a lot of money. And there was the cost of the transport as well. And he did more than one stocking in 1935. It's believed that he also stocked rainbow trout. Now, they would never have bred, and probably within 3 or 4 or 5 years they would have died out. What other fish were stocked back in the day, it's hard to say. Certainly by the late 50s there were roach and gudgeon and tench, eels that could get in there naturally through the outflow brook. But he stocked these bass, and it's important to realise that Breach Pond was not a water open to all for fishing back in the 1930s and 40s. Pike had some pretty expensive fishing tackle. He had a keeper, a Mr. Crumpler, and Crumpler made sure no one else could fish it. The fishing was done from a large Swedish punt, which presumably quite a big boat that was kept moored there and chained up, and the banks were allowed to go completely wild. So even if you went on there without permission, you wouldn't have got the open banks that there are now. So it was pretty difficult to get through to the water. Whether anyone did poach it, I don't know. Anyway, those bass went in there 1935, possibly 36, 37. In the early 50s, Pike passed away, and some of his tackle went to a guy called Ted Crumpler, who was the son of the keeper. He knew a bit about it. And Ted Crumpler was the secretary of Wareham Club in around about 1952-53. But initially nothing happened as far as clubs fishing the water. What happened between about 1952 and the mid-50s, I don't know. Possibly it just stayed private. I believe Dorchester Angling Club, or Dorchester and District Angling Society as their proper name, rented Breach Pond in about 1955, possibly for just 1 year. By then, as far as I can tell, it was full of stunted roach and gudgeon, very small tench, we're talking fish of an ounce or two, and probably the bass. They only had the water for a year. Why? Whether the fishing was disappointing or it was too much of a jungle, I don't know. And about a year or so later, Wareham started to rent the fishing from the Bond estate. Now, the Bond estate owned Tyneham until they were kicked off by the army during the Second World War, Creech Grange, which is very close by, and the house at East Holme, and a lot of land in between and thereabouts. Who exactly owned the land is not clear, but I believe it probably stayed as a clay company, and that was eventually sold to English China Clay. But all that's pretty immaterial, really. There were obviously catches of these largemouth bass in the 1960s, and somehow a couple of people from London to do with Anglers Mail, Lewis Harris and David Marlborough, got wind of these bass being there, and they turned up after some letters between Wareham Club and the Anglers Mail to witness an annual Wareham Junior match that was being fished in the summer. And during that match, Tony Heath, who was then only about 14 or 15, I knew him from 1970 onwards, and his father Owen, who was one of the sort of better match anglers of the club at that time, caught a bass of about £1.6. And eventually this appeared in an article in Angling magazine, which I was shown in the early 70s, but it was only many years later that I managed to locate it. That bass was photographed and killed and taken away to the Natural History Museum in London, and it was properly identified as a largemouth black bass. Weirdly and peculiarly, the club officials were told that they weren't to reveal the location of these black bass to anybody under pain of the Official Secrets Act. Now, I don't think anyone in the club signed the Official Secrets Act, and I can't see why this should be so secret. I think someone was pulling the wool over their eyes and trying to keep a good story under wraps for their own benefit, which is a bit naughty, but that's the way of the world. The next report that I've ever come across of bass, now local Wareham club anglers were obviously occasionally catching these bass, whether it was when they were retrieving a little tiny roach. And when I said stunted earlier on, I'm talking about these fish were 3 and 4 inches long, and it was quite exceptional to get one of even 4 ounces, never mind half a pound. And the gudgeon were even smaller, 3 inches long, tiny little things, none of your gonks or anything like that. So they'd be retrieving a little roach and a bass would take it, or the very small bass would take a maggot. Now, I joined Wareham Club in 1970, and I caught little bass then. I caught a couple that year. In 1969, I've recently been looking through Angling Times for 1968 and 69. Someone from Bovington Camp had obviously joined Wareham Club, and caught one of 2.5 pounds on a lobworm. And there's a photograph in Angling Times. And according to the report, he'd spoken to a club official who said there had been a bass caught some years ago. Well, that was true. Tony Heath caught one in 1965. But I cannot believe that is the whole story, because, like I say, a year later, I caught a couple of tiddler ones. And over the following years, I caught about another 4, all very small. In the early 70s, when I was a little bit older, myself, Phil Dominy, I think it was Richard Gamble, we were fishing up Breach one day where the inflow brook comes in, which is now, it's formed quite a sandbar, but we're talking 50 years ago. So it was a sort of sandy patch in the edge. And there were 4 of these bass just laying there, very inquisitive. We could put the landing net towards it and they'd all sort of line up looking at the edge of it. They didn't swim off. They weren't frightened. We tried maggots. They didn't want to know. And they were between, I think the smallest was about 0.5 pound, which is far bigger than I ever caught. One about 1 pound, 1.5 pounds, and one probably over 2 pounds. Bear in mind, this is a 50-year-old memory, so you'll have to believe me. In the end, we dug some worms out from under a log or something, and I was dangling these worms and trying to almost tickle them out. And about 3 times, this smallest bass, this 0.5 pounder, took the worm. Twice it spat it out the hook, but had got the worm. And the other time I hooked it, it came straight to the top, jumped, fell off the hook. And that was pretty much it. They vanished after that. In the hot summer of 76, I caught a couple of bass, and I caught one the following year. And I can remember John Bass telling me that he'd rescued some tiny bass from the pond over the road, one of the ponds over the road, which was known as Don Berry's pond. Don Berry being the guy who rented it back then. I don't think it's even a fishery now. And bringing some of these tiny bass from Don Berry's pond over. So obviously at some point someone had transferred some bass from Breach Pond to Don Berry's pond, because I don't think that one was ever stocked. But of course we got no records, with no way of knowing if it was or wasn't. And Pike would have owned Don Berry's pond as well, so it's possible he stocked that at the same time or at some time later in the 1930s. These bass became very few and far between during the 70s, very few catch reports. And the last bass that I ever remember seeing, and we saw it a few times around the lily pads, they like the cover and the structure, as the Americans would say. There was one of about 1 pound in around about 1980. By then we'd put carp in there. I think we were about to put rudd in there. There were probably 1 or 2 pike in there. So that the number of species had gone up quite a bit. And then that last one of 1 pound vanished. There were stories of ones in Berry's Pond, which I've never ever fished. I looked in there a few times. People told me that there were still black bass in there 20, 25, 30 years later. And that was eventually sold, as was Breach. Christchurch Club bought Breach back in about 2005. And a hotel not far away bought Berry's Pond. And for a while there was fishing continuing. And I'm told there was still bass in there. What's still in there, whether there are still bass in there, I have no idea whatsoever. There were Leney supposedly stocked a water in Surrey with largemouth bass. What happened to that, I have no idea. And for many years there were rumours that a pond on an American airbase, possibly in Suffolk, also had bass on it. Again, never seen any actual evidence. I can believe it, but whether that's true or not, I don't know. And where they came from, I don't know. So that is my different tale for this week. The only bass I've ever caught since, apart from what are horribly called sea bass in this country. We've only got one bass now. They live in the sea. They're bass. If you're a restaurant, pub, they're bass, not sea bass. You don't call them sea cod, sea plaice. I've caught some smallmouth black bass on a back channel on Toronto Island. I've fished it a couple of times with little Mep spinners and caught them up to about £1, which was quite good fun. And I wish I'd known about the techniques a bit more when there were black bass in Breach Pond all those years, over 50 years ago. Maybe I'd have caught a bigger one. Never really tried for them with spinners or anything else, or little live baits. But there you are. Until next time, it's goodbye for now.